Hi everyone, back again. This is going to be the second lecture to accompany the unit on the history of India for World History 1. So when we left off last time, we had sort of gotten through the Indus River Valley civilization, the Aryan invasion or migration. We talked a little bit about some of the Aryan city-states that had started to develop and how those had sort of interacted with intellectual movements. And so now we're going to sort of continue that. I think we ended with Jainism, and one of the more important religions to come out of the time. However, for most people, when you think of religions coming from India, of course, Buddhism is the first one of those religions. And so, because we sort of ended with religions last time, we're going to start up with those today. Um, and actually, I think this time I'm just going to keep it like this. That way I can see what I've got coming up. Maybe this will expedite things a bit. Okay, and so of course no geography this time either. So 35 slides or 34 slides. We might get out of this in under 30 minutes today. I know many of you were like, not an hour and 10 minutes. And believe me, I am not sure how all those managed to last, even though the slides are different lengths. How they managed to last that long? Maybe it's because I keep talking about why they last that long instead of actually talking about the slides. So here we go. Okay, so what is Buddhism? Well, before we talk about tenets, religion, spread, that sort of stuff, let's look at who the founder is. So remember in the city-states of the Ganges and further north and west, a lot of these leaders and sort of in some of the more independent city-states had sort of cultivated intellectuals, philosophers, religious peripatetics. That's a horrible word, but wanderers is maybe a better word for that. And so the climate of the time, let's say from about 500 BC up to about 300 BC or so, and even to a degree after that, is one of lots of intellectual curiosity being sponsored by different leaders. Um, in some ways to sort of help their reputations and maybe even for their own sort of what you might call spiritual benefit. Um, Remember, these places even had parks specifically designated as curiosity, seeking places. So, Siddhartha Gautama, the guy who is going to become Buddha, the enlightened one, is going to come out of this. Where did he come from? Probably from one of the northern areas near Nepal. So, if you want to go back and look at a map of India again, these are the Himalayan sort of the slopes up to the Himalayas, that general area. Also north and maybe a little bit west of the the mouth of the Ganges. So yeah, his dad was probably Kshatriya, so warrior, noble class. Um, Obviously, this would be sort of what he was expected to do, but as we're going to see, he's going to come up with a different approach to all this. So remember, we don't really have the caste system as we're going to have later when maybe the Portuguese come and start to write about it, and we'll kind of see how that changes as we go through these slides. But we do have certain groups of people who, according to literature, purity laws, and things like that, are supposed to do certain sorts of things. So it's not quite as rigid as it's going to be, but you still have it's. I guess what I'm trying to get at is there are other people besides Siddhartha here who sort of have these soul searching, wandering moments where they go out and try to find these religious leaders. Some of them, like the founder of Jainism, found other religions. Some of them decided, I'll just kind of practice these things as well as I can and go back to the lives that they were sort of in some ways born to lead. But of course, Siddhartha is sort of a different situation here. Dates are kind of are debated. The older sort of system of dating, the older thinking was that maybe around the 500s BC was a good time for his life. But more recently, I think 350 up to about 300, maybe a little bit earlier than that, because once we get to like the 320s, 330s, we're talking about Alexander the Great. But there's definitely some overlap in time. Okay, so these city states in the north. Oh, bad. There we go. Move on to the next slide. So yeah, becomes dissatisfied, renounces his worldly possessions, probably makes his dad upset. Well, that's being a little facetious, but you see something like this with sort of like Martin Luther. He doesn't renounce his family and life, but he renounces his goal to become a lawyer to work in the university because of his sort of conversion and his worry about this thunderstorm that happened. Dad was really upset about that. So maybe a similar situation here. So Buddha goes out, studies, or at this point Siddhartha, we're not enlightened yet, not till 35, studies under different teachers, and don't really like what those teachers say. He goes to Magadha, and if you remember, this is the very powerful city-state that is emerging in the Ganges, sort of an area wrapping down the east coast of India. Um, and in fact, this is going to be the area where the Mauryan Empire that we'll talk about in a few minutes eventually spreads from, and Buddha, or the Buddha, will be part of this one of the rulers of this particular empire. But at this time, the king is like, "Hey, you look like you're a kshatriya. What you doing?" Of course, it's understandable that you would want to go out and figure things out, but maybe it's time to settle down and do your kshatriya stuff. Stop traveling. No, austerity and meditation, and then depending on the various texts that you read. Um, Siddhartha achieves enlightenment. Thus the name Buddha, the enlightened one, when he's 35. He chooses to forego cessation, nirvana. Remember, like with Jainism and some of these these religions that we're going to talk about here that emerge from India are not necessarily aimed at telling people how religion works. They're not sort of explaining religion. They're not meant to. They're not totally meant to. Like, it's not about converting people to a system of belief with priests and bishops and heaven and hell and that sort of stuff. It's more of meant as an approach to dealing with those things that already exist. Because remember, we have this caste system, the Upanishads, the Vedic traditions, and so this is kind of thing he's frustrated with. And so, meditating under this tree achieves enlightenment. So yeah, once he does this, he decides, instead of accepting the cessation, nirvana, sort of the end of the cycles of death and rebirth, he goes to what's traditionally referred to as a deer park near Sarnath, and there he starts, like many of these other teachers are doing at the same time, to teach. He gets 5 followers, sort of his disciples, and the things he teaches, the main tenets he teaches here, again, if you're interested in this, and I'm mentioning this now because it's the first time we've encountered like a big world religion that will have impacts even today. You can get a lot more details. There's these really nice books on Amazon, you can find them for Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, even other more sort of obscure religions. They're called very short guides. If you have introduction, there's like little introductions. We're not going to. So if you're interested in this, or as I'll probably bring this up again when we talk about Christianity, is typically pretty well covered if you're from the area, but maybe not. Maybe you just moved here and you're taking a college class and you're like, I'm from X place and we don't have that there. Well, very short introductions for all these things. So if you're interested in details of this, go look at some of that. But we're just going to kind of cover the basic tenets and something else to think about as we start to think about these world religions. What I'm going over here is going to be what historians, the sort of historical consensus is for how these things were at the time they're created. We'll see this with Christianity, with Islam, here with Buddhism. They change over time. Eventually, monks, ascetics, people like that become associated with spreading Buddhism. Merchants spread it. With Christianity, eventually you get a church, a big hierarchical church. With Islam, you have different people claiming the caliphate and coming up with different ideas. So it's good to keep in mind that, again, some of these teachings, what I'm going for, and this is not a history of religions class, it's not a philosophy or religious studies class. We're just looking at how things were in the past. And keep that in mind too when you get to the point where you're writing if you have a question or something, an essay question, you do comparing religions. It's great if you know what these things look like today, but what I'm looking at is history. So keep that in mind. Okay, so basic outline, 4 noble truths. Life sucks. The reason it sucks is because you want stuff. When you stop wanting stuff, life stops sucking. And to do this, you have to follow this noble eightfold path that Buddha will lay out. So right understanding, right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So again, this is sort of a way to deal with what's already there. the goal is so it's sort of a mixture in some ways of what we looked at with some of the earlier traditions, the moksha, the breaking, the stepping outside of the cycles, and then dharma, working within the system that's already there. Well, it's kind of a little bit of both here. You're working within the system because you have to do that in a certain sense to understand the system. So it's not divine revelation. Buddha's not saying, hey, some divine being spoke to me and told me this is what you got to do and this is how things work. He's not claiming any kind of divine status. He's just saying, as a human, this is what you got to do to get out of this, as the most people in the Indian subcontinent saw it, these cycles sort of drag you and drag everything down. Everything's linked. So there's this idea of karma and dharma here. So what you're looking for is a middle path. You don't want to go too extreme one way or the other. This extreme asceticism can create pride. It can cut you off from the rest of humanity. But of course, also overindulgence can also have negative effects. So 45 years, continues, teaches, disciples, Buddhism starts to spread, and eventually get two different schools of Buddhism that spread throughout first Southeast Asia, around through the Bay of Bengal, down through what comes to be known as Malaysia, Laos, Vietnam, and then up through trade routes from the Straits of Malacca all the way up to southeastern China. And then another sort of different approach that'll come from the West into China anyway. And of course, I mention that now because Buddhism is going to, even more so than in India, Buddhism is going to have a big impact on China and Japan. So 350 BC, maybe earlier, maybe later. I'm not going to make you know the precise date for any of this stuff, but parinirvana, the achievement of nirvana, uh, the cessation, the end. And as we'll see, so modern conceptions of nirvana and a later conceptions of what nirvana is uh, will sort of change. So in some ways, it evolves from this idea of total extinction to more of a total understanding. But that's in the future. Don't have to worry about it quite yet. Um, so we got meditations. This Kanda, this is Gandhara. It's actually an Indian version of the word for the city in Afghanistan, Kandahar. Um, but you also early on, some of the Buddhas you'll see look very sort of ascetic, very sort of like not sort of maybe you don't say desiccated. This is going to be a really weird reference, but maybe you get it if you played Legend of Zelda. Whatever the latest one is on. Oh, Breath of the Wild, that's what it's called. A lot of the little critters that you talk to that give you the Legend of Zelda stuff, they look like these. I think there's probably not a coincidence. Um, Now I'm not saying that Zelda's trying to convert you to Buddhism. Please don't think that, but it's a significant style, an artistic style. So we'll leave it at that. So two schools, Mahayana and Theravada. Mahayana is the one that spreads south and east, and Theravada becomes this sort of school called, I like to call it uh, the old school. Actually, no, it looks like I've got that backwards. I apologize. Theravada is the one that spreads south and east, and then Mahayana is the one that spreads into China. And I think the reason for this, you have Buddhism becomes really popular in China, and it sort of blends with Taoist teachings. And so old local gods, once these ideas, these bodhisattvas, which are people kind of like Buddha who achieved enlightenment but chose to hang around to help other people do it. Um, the sort of local religions can be incorporated like this into a large territory like China. So Mahayana that way, and then Theravada, the old school monks, seclusion, one person sort of there's more of an emphasis here on the individual, at least early on, than there is here. More of an emphasis on not just the individual, but also sort of what you might call in the West a community uh, of all believers. Okay, so basic rundown of Buddhism. Politically speaking, what we're going to deal with when we talk about Imperial India are several sort of attempts to unify the subcontinent. And the problem with looking at this, so we have two big empires that we have here. And I'm going to skip around a bit. Notice this Mauryan Empire. Oh, look at that. Everything's conquered. Well, wait a minute. There's a giant desert here, and there's a giant arid plateau over here, and there's a bunch of people that speak a totally different language down here. What we'll start to see is that in some of these areas, the conquest of the particular area may be more of a sort of a more cursory. It may look so. If you find evidence that there's maybe a pillar here, one of Ashoka's pillars that we'll look at. Maybe you find a road. Well, maybe that's just going to a specific quarry that was used for a type of stone. And maybe when the people were there working it, way out here in the middle of this sort of arid plateau, the Deccan area, maybe it seemed as though maybe like, oh yeah, here's some tribute, thanks for coming around. But as soon as they went uh, back over into this area over in here, it's like, oh no, screw it, we're gonna do what we want to do. So two empires, and the point that I'm trying to make with that is that these are maybe a little ambitious. Maybe I'm sure the leaders would have loved to have claimed they had all this, but maybe the reality wasn't quite as clear. Again, there are no satellite images in the ancient world. Your power goes about as far as you can enforce it. So maybe we'll sort of leave it at that. Okay, so we have the Mauryan Empire. I'm going to come back to some of this too. We also have the Gupta Empire. Notice again, similar sort of a map that we have the old sort of what we call the Aryan heartland here in this the Ganges Valley, and then spreading out over time through a series of different conquests. But these are really going to be I suppose, the two major empires that we talk about until we get to sort of the end of it. So there's not in some ways. There's not as maybe not as much early on as there's going to be. Really, you have to wait for a large sort of unified India. You're not going to get that again to the Mughals. Uh, that really sounded like a Final Fantasy Mughal. So here's your moment of Zen for the day. Nothing to do with the fact that we're talking about Buddhism either. Yeah, there we go. And who doesn't want 7 or 8 of these running around at all times? Right? Maybe. I don't know which one I like better. That one's probably the best. But he has a furry chin. Okay, sorry about that. Moving on. Okay, so long story short, then we'll go back. We've seen these two empires, the Mauryan Empire. Um, come on, the and the Gupta Empire. What does the Mauryan Empire look like? So one of the kings of this Mauryan Empire, probably Chandragupta or Sandrakatos. So the reason we have two names here is there's a Greek traveler named Megasthenes. We'll try one of them, who travels around after Alexander the Great's conquest, and he writes about a leader that would sort of fit this kind of a description. Chandragupta, Chandrakatas. Maybe it's the same person. Also, I would ask you to consider this may not entirely be the case, but I think it's worth thinking. Alexander, Sandra, Alexander. Maybe he had an impact here as well. I know we've not done a lecture on the Alexander and Hellenism yet, but you've probably heard of Alexander the Great, so I'm going to hope for that. Okay. Again, really the Mauryan and the Gupta are going to be the two major empires that everyone's going to kind of look back for. Sort of like in the West, people look back, oh, the Roman Empire, that was a real empire, the good old days of empire. Well, maybe you don't think that, but it's often been discussed that way. And so the Mauryan and the Gupta Empire are going to be very similar here. So um, we even have some treaties, some treaties with some of the uh, people to the west, some of the Hellenistic states after Alexander the Great. Um, and it may, in fact, be there is some speculation that Chandragupta's inspiration for even doing something like this was like, hey, Alexander did it. Well, maybe I can too. And what's really interesting about these three big Mauryan rulers is if we can get them all up here, we'll get them somewhere. Ashoka, Chandragupta, and Bindusara. Each of these three leaders adopts a different version of one of these three. We've not talked about the Ajivikas, not going to, but these are some of the three more popular religions, or maybe in this case, philosophies and approaches that are spreading to the different classes of India at this time, different jatis and varnas, and these maybe they're and so maybe think about this. Why would each leader adopt a different religion or a different approach? maybe it helps with keeping the empire together. We'll see this with Constantine. So it's sort of a theme we've kind of talked about throughout the class. How does a secular ruler, so someone who's in charge of like judgments and laws in the state and the armies, how does that mesh with someone who's also in charge? How do they work with a religious leader? So you would think might have more authority. And it's rarely a case in anything we see throughout world history. Although occasionally it does happen, but it's very rarely the case where a leader comes in and kills all the religious people, or a religious person comes in and completely conquers every. Even if that does happen, it doesn't last very long, relatively speaking. 10, 15 years over the scope of world history is not a lot. You have to have a give and take, and so I think that's kind of what we see here. Oh, excuse me, I just had lunch with the Mauryan Empire. Okay, some name Ashoka is probably the other than Chandragupta, Chandragupta or Sandrakatos. Ashoka is probably the most famous of these rulers. Um, he seems to have killed a lot of people, and we see some of this reflected in these big lion pillars, these pillars that he has, and these stones that he has dispersed throughout his kingdom. Probably in some ways copying uh, other leaders in the past. Maybe there's some we know the Persian leaders did things like this. They put edicts on stone walls. And so this is a new thing for India. Maybe there is some cultural cross cultural uh, idea exchange happening, especially since with the Hellenistic Empire, travel across these areas for a little while anyway is fairly simple. And note the imagery of the wheel of Dharma here. We have the reason we have the lions. Of course, well, it's a lion. If you're a king, a lion's a pretty good symbol to have. But also, I would ask you to consider where Chandragupta, Ashoka, and this empire seems to have originated. And even though they sort of move their capital toward the Ganges area, the family seems to have come from the area, northwest India, where there actually were some lions still kicking around. So maybe that's an indication of some of the connection to that. Okay, if we missed anything, again, you can go back and read some more of these and ask me if you have any specific questions, and I'm going to try to remember today to link some of this up with the sections in the book. So if you want to read some more in the book, hopefully I can get that straightened out by the time these videos go up. Um, the Mauryan Empire is also known for some of its building projects. And if you're going to have an empire, you got to have good roads. You got to make sure the religious folk are happy, so they don't tell the peasants that you're an awful ruler. Um, and you start to have mounds for the relics. Again, what we sort of see here is sort of Buddhism is now, and you'll start to have councils after this for people to decide how Buddhism, monks, and how it should work. It's once the leader sort of disappears, people kind of take over, and so you're going to see it become less of a like one person sort of philosophy that he's teaching, more of a widely accepted religion with monasteries, state sponsorship or non-sponsorship, and those kinds of things. Also during the Mauryan Empire, so you have sort of the official religion, Hinduism, which makes it sound like it's sort of like oh you're Muslim, you're Hindu, you're Catholic. Well, this sort of religion is much more like what we would think of as the sort of the polytheism in the ancient world here. It's not, Hinduism here is not it's not like a monolithic cult and there's like a pope of the Hindus telling everyone what to do. It's more of what we'll see in places like ancient Greece and Rome when we get there, where you have various local gods. Some gods are more favored than others because they occur more frequently. Shiva here, the destroyer, and Vishnu become two of the more important cults in Hinduism that develop. So Buddhism, Jainism, they don't necessarily always appeal to everybody. And so the old sort of old-fashioned way of worshiping, temples, festivals, and that kind of stuff sticks around. Okay, over time, the Mauryan Empire dissolves, takes their great stupas. Here, this is the great stupa at Sanchi. Um, it takes the roads. Some of these things eventually fall apart. Okay, in the meantime, we have the western areas. So what's happening if once we get to like 3 to 100 year zero or so, that's going to be at that particular time anyway. There are two really powerful. I guess we could say there are three really powerful states. Although one, I question exactly what if we're trying to talk about having empires in control, one of them I question, but it's still a very powerful sort of a cultural area. And what I'm talking about here, so we have the Han in China, eventually also the Qin. With the first emperor Shi Huangdi, we have the Roman Empire, product sort of the apex of Hellenism that Alexander the Great starts to develop, and we also have, of course, the Maya, uh, beginning. The Olmecs have kind of fallen by the wayside at this point, but the Maya. So some of these other areas. So we of all the sort of three areas, India is kind of on the fringe of a couple of them, and so these Hellenistic Greek Bactrian. Bactria is just sort of the old Greek name for Pakistan and Afghanistan and areas kind of just to the north in the Himalaya. Those Greek kingdoms, because they are built on the Hellenistic model, which does involve conquest, redistribution of wealth, road building, school building, and things like that, they're going to assert some influence. Now, I will say here, these people are not going to be nearly as powerful as like an Alexander the Great. They're at most pretenders watching from the sidelines. Their main goal is to exert as much power as they can over a very local area, but their model is something like what's left of the Hellenistic Empire, the Roman Empire, and things like that. So they take on these really grand and eloquent titles that have absolutely zero meaning in terms of their actual power. So you have people taking up titles like Savior. You often see these coins that say Soter on them, just means savior, king of kings, lord of lords, emperor of emperors, and you generally find when you have leaders like this in world history, the more of these titles they have, the less powerful they actually are. They want you to come humble yourself and say, "Oh, great Lord and Savior, please grant me a boon. Yes, I have my elephant hat on. What is it you would like, child? Please let me touch your elephant's trunk." No, child, that is sacred. Okay, that's my voice acting for the day. But these are Greek Hellenistic leftovers. Let's put it that way. That have now gained a little bit more power because the Mauryan Empire started to dissolve, and there even eventually there'll be some Christianity. We haven't talked about that, and we will eventually get there when we talk more about Greece, Rome, and the area that that comes from. But there's even some spread, excuse me, of Nestorian Christianity to the east. We start to have the development of the Silk Road because Romans seem to really like silk that comes from China, especially Roman noble women. And so, in exchange for that, glass, lamps, and we even see some coins. And this is, in fact, Augustus. Okay, well, there's no U in Latin, there's a V, but this is Augustus. Um, this is a coin minted in the reign of Augustus, and this was found in southern India. And so, if we go to my little map here, you can see, this is the Silk Road as it's going to develop over maybe the next 1,000 years in Eurasian African history. But even as early as the year 100 AD, zero, you start to have these connections developing from as far away as maybe even Brittany, Galicia, and Spain off the edge of the map, to places like Guangzhou here in China. You have probably the more often traveled water route, but then in some ways the equally dangerous overland route that you're probably more familiar with, the famous Silk Road. But seems to have been a large or a high degree in southern India of people traveling overland for whatever reason, and that's where we find a lot of the Roman artifacts. Okay, what else do we got? We also start to have connections because of the Silk Road. Buddhism is going to start to spread to China, and the famous Buddhas of Bamiyan that were destroyed by the Taliban. Not too long before September 11th attacks, 2001. That's when those are built. Unfortunately, as you can see, they're gone now. To the south, in these areas the Romans are trading, we do have some southern kingdoms starting to grow. These are kingdoms that never really feel a full impact um, of these empires. They speak different languages. They're probably in some ways maybe even related to the old um, uh, Indus River Valley. So they probably bear more resemblance to those areas. And there's some debate in the historical and archaeological community that over as to whether or not these people may have actually migrated from the Indus River Valley and sort of began to intermarry and settle in these areas further to the south after whatever climate problem happened in the Aryan invasion. Okay, the next after maybe a couple hundred years, 300 years of this unity, you have the rise of another dynasty, another Chandragupta. Um, Sounds like a good name, but you often see this throughout history: the Louis in France, the Ramses in ancient Egypt. Um, the Romans are kind of individualistic, so maybe we won't cite the Romans there. Um, Again, this Ganges River Valley seems to be the sort of area, the Makkah. That's the city. Remember, that's one of the more important cities that we saw early on develop in the Ganges Valley. Well, that's going to continue to be an important capital here. And in this case, you're going to have a little more influence spread to the south and east. And I think this is partially a reaction, maybe against some of the petty kings, and also probably against the strengthening Sasanian empire to the west. So the Sasanians will take over after the Seleucids, and those are just two dynasties that govern what we think of today as parts of Iraq, Mesopotamia, modern Iran. So more of a spread here. And if you're going to control the lucrative trade, I would say south and east is the way to go in this particular situation. Um, Pretty good. I should say, pretty good sort of defines how well the Guptas were able to hold together their empire until about the 500s when Hun invasion that also and the Hun here, it's really not a very useful term in terms of trying to be like if you're sort of asking specifically who these people were. Are they? Let's see. This is to defeat. Yeah, the Huns. Is this a Hun? Probably. Oh, look, I've got my evil eyebrows and my bird of prey and my shirtless vagabonds, the elite Hun soldiers with their Fu Man. Because you can't be a Hun without a Fu Manchu, right? Well, this even begins to be used in the 19th century and the early 20th century by people who are trying to sort of disparage. Like in Western Europe, the Germans are thought of as the Huns, destroying civilization. It kind of comes to be sort of a catch-all for barbaric tribes. Um, Uh, the HSIUNG is the name the Chinese give for a specific group of people that lives in what we think of today as like Kazakhstan, Mongolia, probably in some ways related to the Mongols, who will eventually become important. Um, but it's hard to say exactly who these people are. Whoever they were, they invade. Guptas fall apart. Smaller petty kingdoms rise again, and as time goes on, Buddhism just sort of seems to it continues in India, but it becomes sort of more incorporated into these local polytheistic religions. It does the same thing in China, but it's in China and especially Japan where Buddhism will really thrive as time goes on. That's just a quick map of the Gupta Empire. Some of the areas, this is the Straits of Malacca, the very powerful kingdom here that controlled trade from the east and eventually to the west. So this is kind of some of the areas where the Gupta Empire and spread and where some of their wealth would have come from. So yeah, it's traditionally sort of seen as a golden age. Official sponsorship of all the major religious traditions, which makes sense if you want people to like you. You don't generally pick favorites unless you want to piss a portion of the population off. Um, and this is sort of interesting too. You might think for a second, okay, well, duh, zero and infinity, we know what those things are, but think about it. If these are not concepts that are developed in mathematics in the West. They have to be brought in through these Hindi or Hindu numerals that are adopted by uh, Muslim uh, uh, writers and philosophers. They're sort of imported. So this is, we call them Arabic numerals. Well, they're actually from here. Um, you might think, well, why do you need these? What would make this area so special? Well, think about it. If one of your religions aims at complete annihilation, well, maybe you have a philosophical reason for needing zero. So this is an instance where I think you can see math is often seen as a hard science. Numbers don't lie. You hope you hear people saying it like that. But I think it's also useful to remember that even things like math can be grounded in special social circumstances. So in other words, here, maybe if you don't have an idea of endlessness, or maybe if you don't have an idea of nothingness, maybe your math is. But think about it too. I mean, how much time in your daily life do you spend with zero of anything. There's always something, right? There's air, there might be a table, a pencil, a computer. Numbers are easy. You can say, I have 5 fingers on one of my hands. Um, we see, so this is sort of why humans are really good at dealing with like very small numbers. More abstract things like zero and infinity, even like hundreds of thousands, sounds good, but oftentimes there's not a whole lot of practical experience with it. Um, so just a thought to throw out there as well, especially when you're talking when you well some of these societies will say, we fought an army of 500,000, or you'll see a writer say our king lived 3.7 million years. I mean these are not numbers that people encounter on a daily basis. So maybe take some of those numbers with a grain of salt when you're dealing with those. It's kind of off topic, but I thought I'd throw it out there since we're talking a little bit about math and history. Um, Maybe I should make them because I think it's sort of when I said that it sounded like I was saying math. It's just all just. No, I'm not saying that. It's not saying it's just all made up, but a lot of times you will read. The main point for this whole discussion is number one, we don't have zero without India or infinity in mathematics. Number two, always take numbers when used to describe armies and links of reigns. If they seem outlandish, they probably are. Um, Poetry, those kinds of things, caste system, consolidates. This is where we start to see what looks more like the caste system that's going to evolve when the Portuguese and other people land in India to sort of write for us the casta and the jati, that thing that the birth portion of the caste system. That's what the Portuguese are going to be talking about. Some other exciting architecture, more state sponsorship, and you can see if they're not sponsoring a lot of Buddhist stuff, maybe there's been more acculturation and incorporation. Um, Mahayana Buddhism seems to have done fairly well in areas to the south and west and the Indian sort of Indian peninsula. These Anjata caves are considered some of the most beautiful examples of cave painting, cave architecture on the world or in the world. And so I thought we'd take a look at them kind of quickly just to let you have a peek. So we have different monk cells like CELL for contemplation, meditation, but also beautiful architecture. And it's in these above these cells that we have different bodhisattvas, different sorts of sutras that are painted. So sutras are sort of verses, teachings. And of course, the most famous of all these, and you can see some of it depicted here, is aimed at, no, I call it the Book of Sex, the Kama Sutra. In the Upanishadic tradition, that should probably only have one P in it, there are four goals: desire, prosperity. God, wow, my spelling is magical today. Virtuous, is that right? That looks good. Virtuous living and liberation. Um, One of these, desire. So this idea you have to sort of explore all these to understand the world. Well, so you got to have a book for it. Uh, Vatsyayana is reputedly the author of this, but yeah, fairly famous text. Um, all right, and then this is just a random picture from Indiana Jones because why not? Misrepresentations of Shiva. What can I say? It's still a fun movie though, especially when they're chanting Kale Ma Shatine and the gators eat the bad guys. All right, that's all I got. We'll see how much time that took. Hopefully not too long. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you soon.